Okay, so in this video, we're just going to talk about cranial nerves. The cranial nerves are nerves that come off of the brain, and then they're going to go to structures, usually from the neck on up. There is one cranial nerve that extends all the way down into the thoracic cavity and into the abdominal cavity, but the rest of the cranial nerves communicate with structures from the neck on up. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, meaning there are 12 cranial nerves on the right and 12 cranial nerves on the left. The cranial nerves are numbered, cranial nerve 1 through cranial nerve 12, but instead of using our numbers, we use Roman numerals. The cranial nerves with the lower Roman numerals, like 1 and 2 and 3, they're going to extend off of the brain closer to the frontal lobe, like up here. And the ones that have the higher Roman numeral, like 10, 11, and 12, they're going to extend off of the brainstem, off of the medulla oblongata. Let's go through the names and the Roman numerals of each of the cranial nerves. There's the olfactory nerve, which is cranial nerve 1, the optic nerve, which is cranial nerve 2, the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 3, the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4, the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5, the abducens nerve, cranial nerve 6, the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7, the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8, glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 9, vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11, and hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve 12. So what you have to do is be able to identify, you have to know, first of all, their name and their number. You have to be able to match them up. You have to be able to identify whether they contain sensory neurons or motor neurons or both. And you have to be able to identify what their motor function is and their sensory function is. So as you remember, off of the spinal cord, those spinal nerves that come off of the spinal cord, they contain both sensory and motor neurons. Do you remember how the dorsal root and the ventral root came together to form that spinal nerve? Well, the dorsal root was sensory only, and the motor root was, ventral root was motor only, right? So by the time they got to this spinal nerve right here, the spinal nerve contained both the sensory and the motor fibers. Well, that's not so with these cranial nerves. Some of them are just going to carry sensory neurons, and some of them are just going to carry motor neurons. So here's a chart that we can use to help us to remember the names and the numbers. And I always like to use mnemonics when I'm remembering the cranial nerves and the numbers. And you can look up online for any number of mnemonics, but I use one that I'm going to share with you now. And so a mnemonic is when you take the first letter of the word and you make another word out of it that you can remember. And when you string all of these words together, then you come up with some sentence. So the mnemonic that I would recommend that I use is O, 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 to touch and feel very green vegetables, heaven. Okay, so the first letter of each word matches up, right? So that's how you can kind of help yourself to remember the names of the cranial nerves. And then for the number, that helps you to remember which one comes first and which one comes last and in between, right? So that's, you can come up with your own mnemonic, or you can look up other mnemonics online, whatever you want to do. There's plenty of them out there. Then you have to be able to match up the name with the number. So make sure you're able to do that. On the lecture exam, I might put the name or I might put the number. On the lab exam, all you have to do is identify the cranial nerve by its name, not by its number. Then we have to identify whether these cranial nerves carry sensory neurons or motor neurons or both. And so we can use another mnemonic, and using this mnemonic, we'll use the letter S to mean that they only carry sensory neurons. And we'll use the letter M if they carry just motor neurons. And the letter B if they carry both sensory and motor neurons. So then I'm going to come up with a mnemonic using the letters S, M, and B, right? So this is the mnemonic that I use. Some say marry money, but my brother says bad business, marry money. So in other words, her brother is saying, don't marry for money. It's bad business. So what that tells us is that the olfactory nerve then, up here, the olfactory nerve, only carries sensory neurons. And since we know that it only carries sensory neurons, then it can't have a motor function, and we can just cross off the motor function there. And the optic nerve is sensory only, so we can cross off the motor function there. If it has sensory neurons only, it can only have a sensory function. The oculomotor nerve is motor only, so we can cross off sensory function. The trochlear nerve is motor only. The trigeminal nerve has both sensory and motor functions. The abducens has motor only, so we'll cross off sensory. The facial nerve has both. The vestibulocochlear nerve has sensory only. The glossopharyngeal, so there's a little L that's missing in there. The glossopharyngeal nerve carries both sensory and motor neurons. The vagus nerve carries both. The accessory nerve carries motor only, so we can cross off sensory. And then the hypoglossal nerve is motor only, so we can cross off sensory there. Okay, now all we have to do is go back and fill in the blanks. And so now we're going to say what the function is of each of these cranial nerves. So the olfactory nerve is sensory only. Olfactory is the sense of smell. So this cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve, carries the sense of smell back to the cerebrum. The optic nerve is sensory only, and that will carry the sense of sight back to the cerebrum. The oculomotor nerve is motor only, and oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens all sort of have the same function. They're all motor. They send commands to the muscles that control eyeball movement. So what we can say is that they move the eyeball. So whenever there's a motor function, that means that the command is going out to a skeletal muscle to contract, and that's going to move something. So oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens all move the eyeball. In addition to that, the oculomotor nerve also controls the muscles of the iris of your eye. So the iris is that colored portion of your eye, and in the middle of the iris is the pupil. And so when those muscles contract, the pupil is either going to dilate and get bigger, or it's going to constrict. And so the oculomotor nerve is going to control the constrictor muscle, and so it can constrict the pupil. So this is one way that you can distinguish the oculomotor nerve from the trochlear and the abducens. Now, each one of those nerves will move the eyeball in a different direction, but I'm not that concerned with you knowing that in general A&P. But you just need to know that the oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens, they move the eyeball, and in addition to that, the oculomotor nerve will constrict the pupil. Then we have the trigeminal nerve, and so the trigeminal nerve has both sensory and motor function. The sensory function is touch to the face and the mouth and the eye ball, okay? So if you touch your face, you can feel that because the trigeminal nerve is sending that information back to your brain. If you have marbles in your mouth, the trigeminal nerve is detecting that and sending that information back to your brain. If someone pokes you in the eyeball, that pain that you're feeling is going to be sent back through the trigeminal nerve back to your brain. Then we have the motor portion of the trigeminal nerve. So the trigeminal nerve sends commands to the muscles of mastication. And so that is like your masseter muscle. And do you remember what the masseter muscle does? It's used for chewing, right? So the masseter muscle causes you to clench your jaws. So the trigeminal motor function is chewing or clenching the jaw. Okay, and then we have the facial nerve. The facial nerve is both sensory and motor. So for sensory, the facial nerve deals with taste. Actually, taste to the front of your tongue. To be exact, the anterior 2/3 of your tongue, right? So when you put something on the front of your tongue, that sensory information on what you're tasting is going to go through that facial nerve back to your cerebrum. For the motor portion, the facial muscle is going to send commands to the skeletal muscles of your face for facial expressions. So that is responsible for facial expressions. Okay, then we have the vestibulocochlear nerve. The vestibulocochlear nerve is sensory only. So there's two parts to that. It's a really long name. So there's a vestibular part and there's a cochlear part. The vestibular part is balance. So your sense of balance, that's a perception, that's a sensation. That information gets sent back to your brain through the vestibular branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. The cochlear branch then will monitor hearing. So whatever you're hearing, that's going to go back to your brain through the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. Then we have the glossopharyngeal nerve. Glossal means tongue. So glossal has both sensory and motor. Glossopharyngeal for sensory is going to monitor taste, and it's taste to the back of your tongue. To be specific, to the posterior 1/3 of your tongue. So whenever you have anything on the back of your tongue, that information will be sent back to your brain through the glossopharyngeal nerve. For the motor function of the glossopharyngeal nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve will send commands to those skeletal muscles in your throat that cause you to swallow. So glossopharyngeal motor function would be swallowing. Then we have the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve, again, is both sensory and motor. The vagus portion of this nerve is taste again, but it's taste to the throat. So yeah, you have taste buds in your throat, and they can detect, there's receptors back there that can taste water or detect the presence of water. And so that information will go through the vagus nerve back to your brain. Then the vagus nerve has a motor function as well. And so The vagus nerve is 75% of your rest and digest nervous system. And it goes, this is the only nerve that travels all the way down your thoracic cavity and then into your abdominal cavity, and it goes to your stomach and to your intestines, and it goes to your lungs and your heart. And so the motor function of the vagus nerve would be that it can decrease your heart rate, it can decrease your respiratory rate, because those are all things that you would do when you were resting and digesting. It would increase your digestive activity. So if it were overactive, then your digestive activity might be overactive and you might end up with vomiting or diarrhea or excess secretions in the digestive area. The next nerve is the accessory nerve, and the accessory nerve is motor only. The accessory nerve sends commands to the muscles in the skeletal muscles in your neck and your shoulders. And so the motor function then would be to help you shrug or turn your head. Then we get to the hypoglossal nerve, and so hypo means below and glossal means tongue, and the hypoglossal nerve is motor only. It's underneath the tongue, and it will send motor commands to the muscles of your tongue, so it moves your tongue. Okay, now, so that's what you have to memorize for the lecture exam. Hopefully, I've given you some ideas on how you can memorize those. For the lab exam, you're going to be using the diagrams and identifying the nerve on the diagram. This is the picture that you would use for the olfactory nerve. So this is the cranium, and it's a cross section of the cranium. So this here is the nasal cavity. Okay, and then this right here, these nerves, right, that's part of the cranial nerve 1. So if you've memorized that chart, this is a huge clue, because you know cranial nerve 1 is the nerve that monitors the sense of smell. This is a picture that shows 4 different cranial nerves on it. The bigger nerve on the back here, that's the optic nerve, cranial nerve 2. And then we have 3, 4, and 6. So 3, 4, and 6 are the nerves that control the muscles that move the eyeballs. Cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor, cranial nerve 4 is trochlear, and cranial nerve 6 is abducens. So if you want to try to remember this better, just to come up with some easy way to remember this, you look at this nerve, it's O, this nerve is T, this nerve is A, OTA. And so that's oculomotor on the top, trochlear, and then abducens. Here is cranial nerve 5, which is the trigeminal nerve. And if you remember what the trigeminal nerve does, it is sensory to the skin of the face and in the mouth. So this is the actual trigeminal nerve right here. And then those neurons come into a ganglion, and then they split off. And you can see the endings of the nerves are going all the way out here to the superficial area. They're on top of the bone, but they're really supplying the skin. So I think that's how you can remember this one. It has 3 branches, one that goes up to all of the area on the forehead, one that goes to the cheek and the nose area, and then one branch that goes all the way into the mouth and down by the chin. So it's sensory to the skin of those areas. So that's the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5. So this is the facial nerve, and if you remember, the motor portion of the facial nerve is to control the muscles of facial expression. So we can see the orbicularis oculi right here. That's the one that would help your eyes to squint. Here's the orbicularis oris, where you can pucker your mouth. So those are just all muscles of facial expression. And so we see the facial nerve right here, and again, it's coming into a ganglion, and then it's splitting off into several branches, and all of those branches are going out to the muscles of facial expression. So I think that's how you can remember the facial nerve. This is cranial nerve 8, and it's the vestibular cochlear nerve. This is actually a picture of the inner ear. So this is the ear canal out here, this is the middle ear in here, and this area in here is the inner ear with these two structures. This structure down here is called the cochlea. We'll talk about that later. But this is the cochlear branch that relays the sense of hearing back to the brain. And then this is the vestibular branch, which relays the sense of balance back to the brain. So together, this nerve is the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8. On this picture, we are seeing the glossopharyngeal nerve, or cranial nerve 9. If you remember what we said about sensory for the glossopharyngeal nerve is that it monitors taste to the back of the tongue. So there we have one of its branches. It comes out, and then one of its branches is going into the back of the tongue. So it's monitoring taste there. And then it's also used for swallowing. So we can see that it's going into those muscles here in the back of the throat that help to swallow. This picture is showing cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus nerve. And so the vagus nerve, you can't see where it's labeled, but it's coming off of the brainstem up here. And this nerve sounds like vagrant, and a vagrant is someone who travels, doesn't really have a home in one place. And this is the only nerve that is a vagrant, and it travels down into the neck area, it travels into the thoracic area, to the heart, and to the lungs, and it even reaches all the way down into the abdominal pelvic area, to the stomach, to the intestines, to the pancreas. And so that's why we think of, that's how it was named actually, was vagus nerve, is a vagrant nerve. And the last two cranial nerves are found on this picture. So first we have the accessory nerve, which is cranial nerve 11. And it's coming off of the brain stem right here. So this is the nerve right here. And you can see that it goes down to the SCM muscle. That's this muscle. And then there's a branch that also goes over to the trapezius right over here. So the accessory nerve innervates the muscles of the neck, the skeletal muscles, to help your head turn from right to left, and then for you to shrug your shoulders as well. Then the other nerve in the, looks like the title here has been taken off, or the label. It's this one right here, and that's cranial nerve 12. And that one is called the hypoglossal nerve. And we can see the hypoglossal nerve going under the tongue, because that's what hypoglossal means, under the tongue. And so it helps a person to move their tongue around. The last thing that I want to say about cranial nerves is that when we are putting a title to them, we give the name, but we can also just write the number, and N stands for cranial nerve, and then the Roman numeral. So cranial nerve 1, cranial nerve 2, cranial nerve 3, cranial nerve 4, etc. Okay, that's all I have for the cranial nerves.